Good evening and welcome to our first lecture in our Thursdays with George Presidential Month virtual lecture series. My name is Cynthia Riccio. I'm the Director of Education here at the Webb Dean Stevens Museum. We would like to thank the Society of the Cincinnati for their support for this lecture series. The Society of the Cincinnati is the nation's oldest patriotic organization, founded in 1783 by officers of the Continental Army and their French counterparts who served together in the American Revolution. The society is made up of 14 constituent societies, one for each of the 13 colonies and France, and is headquartered in Washington, D.C. Briefly, their mission is to promote knowledge and appreciation of the achievement of the American independence. The Connecticut Society helps to achieve that through many of their nonprofits, such as the Webb Dean Stevens Museum and other organizations. I would like to now introduce our Executive Director, Joshua Campbell Torrance.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Well, I'm so happy to be here with you this evening, broadcasting from the Washington Bedchamber at the Webb Dean Stevens Museum. The Webb Dean Stevens Museum has been owned and operated by the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in Connecticut since 1919. The Dames are a leader in preservation, restoration, and interpretation of historic sites. Specifically, the NSCDACT promotes colonial and revolutionary heritage through historic preservation, patriotic service, and education. The organization is also a genealogical society, and a member demonstrates her descendancy from an ancestor who has provided service to the colonies prior to the Revolutionary War. For more information, please visit nscdact.org. We're very excited to have the launch of this great series, and we're particularly excited to launch it with Steve Bashore. He's the Director of Historic Trades at George Washington's Mount Vernon. In his position, he oversees the interpretation, operation, and maintenance of Washington's Distillery and Gristmill, as well as the Farm and Blacksmith Shop. Steve is a traditional miller and distiller by trade and has been operating, interpreting, and repairing historic watermills for 27 years. Since 2007, he has been distilling at George Washington's reconstructed distillery, producing rye whiskey, bourbon, single malt whiskey, rum, as well as peach and apple brandy. He has been a spirits judge for the American Craft Spirits Association and for the World of Whiskies. Steve has traveled extensively in the United States, England, and Europe, researching windmills, watermills, and distilleries, and lectures regularly on these subjects. Let's give a very warm Webb Dean Stevens welcome to Steve. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it's an honor to be with you. And as I mentioned earlier, just to see you in that beautiful room there and know the history that took place there, it's fitting to all join tonight to talk about Washington and the history and tie to the American Revolution. So I want to take us through a little walk through the history, partially of the farms at Mount Vernon, which tell the story of the development of his businesses. As most people think of Washington, it's often for most Americans as the statesman and the first commander-in-chief of the military and later our first president. But throughout all those years, Washington ran a large estate that grew from about 2,100 acres when he inherited it to about 8,000 by the mid-1780s. So part of our job in historic trades is to bring the living history farms and businesses to life. And so with that, I think I'll start the presentation here, and these images will help tell the story, I hope. If I can get them to advance. I may have to rely on Joshua again. Joshua, maybe you could take control and I'll just, you can help me along if you don't mind. This is a picture, actually a painting. It looks like a photograph. This was done by Ian Gray, a Scottish artist, and the distillery there has a Scottish tie, which we'll talk about. But I've entitled tonight "Farmer, Merchant, Miller, Distiller." It's really the entrepreneurial story of George Washington. We can go to the next image. If you have not visited Mount Vernon, the key location of the estate along the Potomac River was critical to the businesses Washington ran. Alexandria, Virginia was 9 miles the other way down the river, past the house, out to the Chesapeake Bay, the Caribbean, and overseas markets. So as we all know, the waterways of the 18th century were much more critical than the rough roads that people had to deal with. So being on the river there at the Potomac really helped a lot of his business be the most optimum they could be. So we can go to the next. It's a wonderful illustration that shows the mansion house in the background, and Washington is a hands-on manager. I often think that if you worked for him, it probably would have been a bit difficult at times because he was such an exacting man about his land and the farms. But this is a view of Mansion House Farm, and they did grow small amounts of crops here, but Washington actually had 5 farms. We'll talk about the outlying farms, but Mansion House, he sometimes refers to as Home House Farm. And that's when you visit the estate today, you see the historic area is all part of what was Mansion House Farm. So we can move on to the next. This is a lovely map that we have, which Washington drew himself in 1793. So if you ever wondered what his handwriting looked like, you are looking at it right now. The legend at the top talks about undeveloped fields. In the top right, you can see the farms listed: Union Farm, Muddy Hole Farm, which was aptly named, as Muddy Hole was not the most productive farm. Then he had River Farm along the Potomac and Dogue Run Farm, which was out where the gristmill and distillery were built. So he drew this actually in 1793, and at that time, he was thinking about leasing land to tenant farmers. We would call it downsizing. I think at that point in his life, when the presidency being his main work, he was looking to take a little bit of the burden of managing such a large estate off his hands. As it turned out, it didn't work out. He didn't find the proper people to be tenants or lease the farm, so he retained it until his death in 1799. The original of this is at the Huntington Library in California, but we do have copies, and it really helps us to understand the scope of the plantation. And in the center, it's hard to tell, he drew all those trees, but there was the 4,000 acre forest in the center of Mount Vernon. So you have about 3,200 acres under crop and the rest in forest or undeveloped pasture. So we can move ahead there. And as most people know Virginia history, tobacco was the crop that built Virginia. If you travel in Virginia and visit the historic homes along the James River or just west of Williamsburg, along all those rivers that came up to the Potomac, you'll see a lot of brick mansions that were built between about 1730 and 1780, really the heyday of tobacco. And so Washington inherits a tobacco plantation. And it was good in the early years, but one of the difficulties he ran into is the soil at Mount Vernon and in this part of Virginia, if you dig anywhere, it's clay. And so it wasn't the best tobacco land. So that led to other changes he'd make in the coming years. The second biggest crop, though, was corn. And of course, corn's going to feed everyone that lives and works here: the enslaved population, the paid staff, the indentured servants, and Washington's own table. So corn is always a staple at Mount Vernon, and it was key to sustenance. Now, in the 1760s, after marrying Martha, Washington is doing many things. He's expanding, buying land, enlarging the estate, but he's also reading a variety of new publications in this era when scientific methods were beginning to be applied to farming. So John Bordley was one of them. He actually corresponded with. The Annals of Agriculture by Arthur Young. He was a Scotsman. They had a long correspondence over a period of over 10 or 15 years. But in the 1760s, these books are helping Washington look at his land in a different way and think about how to improve the soil. Tobacco is very hard on the soil, and what he was running into was he was starting to slide into some debt because you have 1 or 2 bad crop years in tobacco, and then you're in debt to the English factors or the Scottish factors, the middlemen that sell your tobacco. So he realized he had to start doing crop rotation and experimenting with fertilization and livestock that he learned to manage better, all through reading. Okay, we can move on. This is actually Washington's a copy of his notebook from one of those books he read. He didn't really mark up his books in the margin, with 1 or 2 exceptions. he took notes and transcribed them into his own farming notebooks. This is owned by the Library of Congress, but we have, you know, images of it. And this is a harrow that he built based on designs from those books. So we're very fortunate to have the depth of records we do about not only his public life, but his work at Mount Vernon as a farmer and as the manager of the estate. So the harrow was part of his use on the top of the fields after plowing to level and grade those fields and turn seed back into the soil to be properly grown. So these notebooks are a wealth of information for us. Another person that all of us, I know Joshua has probably heard of Jethro Tull because we occasionally have talked about music, but there was a real man, Jethro Tull, and he wrote a book called Horse Hoe Husbandry. And this was a book in Washington's library. It was very influential on him. And one of the things you have to remember about 18th century farming was the science really had not caught up with what they were postulating. So for instance, Tull writes that plants have little mouths, and if we can turn the soil over and break it down properly, they're better able to eat the nutrients and grow better. Well, that's not what is really happening, but guess what? If you fertilize and till the soil properly, you get better outcomes and better yields. So to the 18th century thinker on farming, this appeared to be a good theorem. What they did do is apply the proper machines to get the soil in the proper shape, so you would have better growth of your crops. So this was certainly a book that influenced Washington. Now, what he changes to from tobacco is wheat. Wheat becomes a perfect option for him for 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, it's not controlled by the British Crown. Tobacco was an enumerated good that the Crown controlled. There were several of those type of items that they wanted from the colonies. So if you were a tobacco planter in Virginia or Maryland, you had to get your tobacco inspected at a public warehouse. It was then shipped on British ships back to Scotland or England, where it was graded and sold for you. And you got tobacco notes, not cash, with which you could buy British goods. So in good times, this worked out well. But as I said, Washington fell into 2 or 3 bad crop years in the mid-1760s, and he knew he had to get out of tobacco. So he switched to wheat because there was a burgeoning flour market developing that really has its origin in the late 1680s and 90s, when the colonies first have enough surplus grain to feed their own populations. So they're looking for markets. And one of those first markets was the Caribbean. And those are sugar islands. So they needed the foodstuffs from colonial America. So American ships laden with flour, cornmeal, and sometimes even baked bread would go down to the Caribbean, bringing back molasses, sugar, and rum, and sometimes enslaved people back to these shores. So wheat was a crop he could turn into flour, and he could ship it to any port. Eventually, it ships it to Southern Europe. He even had one shipment go to Suriname. So Washington realizes this is an independent market. I can take it on consignment wherever I want to send it, dealing with the ship's captain, and I don't have to play in the British system anymore. And this turned out to be a really forward-thinking move. A lot of Virginians did not get out of tobacco until too late and lost quite a lot of money. But for Washington, he abandons tobacco for wheat in 1766. So it's pretty early. Now here's another of the 5 farms map with a little more detail, just so you can get oriented. So down in the bottom center, you can see that's the mansion. And when you visit Mount Vernon today, we own land around there, about 500 acres. Again, you see the 8,000 acres, but if you pan to your left and follow the Dogue Run Creek, you'll see where the Distillery and Gristmill are located out there as the creek narrows. So as we get deeper in now, we're going to really hone in on the Distillery and Gristmill site. This is the gristmill today. It is a reconstruction built on the original foundations. And in 1770, Washington built a merchant mill on Dogue Creek because he needed a bigger, larger mill to make that export flour. And I say that to point out this: he already owned a mill that he inherited from his father and brother. And that was what we call a country mill. It really served the plantation. It might have ground for a few local farmers, but it didn't have the machinery and equipment to make really superfine export flour. So when Washington's transitioning out of tobacco to wheat, he already knows, I need a new mill. And so he sited it along the creek here, and he had to build a mill pond above the mill 2 miles back on higher elevation. So although the creek is there behind the mill, you got to get water over top of a wheel for it to turn. So he couldn't use the creek water from Dogue at that point. So he cut a 2-mile long mill race, which went back through the farm. It took a year to dig that. And on that back end at the higher elevation, it built a large mill pond, a reservoir, and then water would flow downhill to the mill to run the wheel. And you might notice, you ask yourself, where's the wheel? Well, it's an interior wheel, and that's going to protect it more from the winter. And I could bet you, being a miller, that in your region, many, many mills up there had interior water wheels because of your winters. And you see that in Northern Europe and England as well. It just was a way to protect that water wheel. And so if you ever come across an old mill building and you see arches on the upper part and the lower part, you know why. That's where the water flowed through the mill to turn that wheel. So let's go on. This is our wheel today. It's a 16-foot wheel made of white oak, and it's the same size that Washington had. We were very fortunate. The mill itself was restored in 1932 as a commemorative mill by the state of Virginia. And so it had machinery from an old mill, but it never ran. Mount Vernon took it over in the mid-1990s and did a major restoration. And we hired an English millwright who lived in Virginia, who was actually one of my mentors. And one of the reasons I love mills so much, his name was Derek Ogden. And Derek did all the plans and drawings for this. And he's old school. He does the blueprints on a drafting table by hand. He does not use CAD. And then we have 2 or 3 craftsmen that work at Mount Vernon on special projects, and they built this machinery to be accurate to the 1700s. So this water wheel drives all the wooden gears, which we'll see next. There's our gearing. And keep in mind, this is all pre their ability to really cast large iron gears, which comes along starting in the 1805, 1810, 1815. You'll see mills change and even metal water wheels be built later. But this is all the era of wood. Now, there are metal bearings in some parts of the mill that are iron, but mostly made of wood. So that big wooden shaft in the center was once a white oak tree. And that shaft weighs about 5,000 pounds, if you can believe it. And that water wheel will turn the shaft, turn these gears to rotate 2 sets of millstones on the floor above. So we can look at those stones, I think, next. Now, just as Washington had 2 different goals for the mill, one was export flour, and those stones you see in the foreground that are open, and you can see the grooves or the furrows in the stone. Those are the French burr stones that he used to make export flour. The French stones were first quarried in the 1300s, and they were exported by the thousands into the colonies. They are freshwater quartz, extremely hard, and they were the best millstone money could buy. And Washington bought a set and had them installed when the mill opened in 1771. And I mentioned earlier how exacting he was. And if you worked for him, sometimes it might be a little bit tough. Well, he wrote the man he got the stones from, and he replied, the stones are fine, but they're 2 inches thinner than you said they were going to be. So I have this mental image of Washington walking into that mill after they arrive and putting a measuring stick on there to see if he got what he paid for. And you'll see that thread throughout his life, which is this attention to detail matters. And it applied in the military, it applied as president, it applied certainly in running of his estate. Now the stones there are open and on the stone crane because we were working on them, but you see in the background the other set of stones with all the wooden furniture around them. And in that hopper on the top is where the grain would go to be fed through the stones to be ground. And I think we have another closer image of that here next. Yeah, there's both sets of stones with the mill furniture on it. And so basically, if you've been in a mill or seen an old mill operate, the top stone rotates, powered by the gearing and the wheel. The bottom stone's mounted to the floor and is stationary. And between those 2 stones, those grooves or furrows of the millstone cut and rip that grain down into flour. It goes down by gravity down a chute where it's then sifted and ready for market or ready for use on the estate. Do keep in mind the stones never touch. If I say on tour, if your stones rub together, bad things happen. And the first bad thing is you're grinding more than grain. You're grinding bits of millstone into your flour, which your customers will let you know about. So the top stone is adjustable. The mill has very exacting controls, which is quite interesting for that time period. So we can adjust the top stone up or down, so we can make very fine flour. We can make medium grade. We can make grits, which are very popular in the South. And this mill at Mount Vernon today does make food grade product for our retail shops and for restaurants. So as we talk about the history, keep in mind these are also working buildings that do produce product. Okay, Joshua, maybe we could have the next. just a closer look at the stones. And again, they call those mill furniture. It just keeps that grain flowing down into the stone, and the wooden casing prevents that flour from flying out all over the floor, so it goes down the proper chute. Okay. Now, the other part of the mill that's quite interesting story is that in 1790, the US Patent Office was formed. And prior to that, if you were an inventor, you had to get your machine, your idea patented in each individual state, which meant a lot of travel and a lot of wrangling with legislatures to get your patent rights. So the patent office is formed, and a gentleman named Oliver Evans, who had invented the automated flour mill system, applies for a federal patent. And believe it or not, there wasn't a major bureaucracy as yet in Washington. So George Washington, as president, had to sign approved patents. So which means he read that over and he realized, you know, I think I need this at my mill at Mount Vernon. He sent it down to Thomas Jefferson to sign as well as vice president. And Tobias Lear was Washington's private secretary, and he writes to Oliver Evans, and we have those letters at Mount Vernon in our archive. And the letter reads, "The president is desirous of you to come to Mount Vernon and install the system in his mill." And that happened in the fall of 1791. And Evans basically invented a way to move grain through a mill automatically, and a couple of other unique machines to help process flour. And he holds US patent number 3 for that time. So it's quite a neat invention. And we have one of only 2 working Oliver Evans mills in the United States, and we run it regularly. And it's a real kick for visitors to see that machine run. Now, to the right is the book plate that Evans would write in 1795 called the Young Millwright and Miller's Guide. It went through 15 editions by 1850. So this is really, to use a term, it was the milling Bible for half a century. And Oliver Evans is really one of those unknown, I think, unsung American inventors of that age. And he was quite a genius. So it's fun. That's part of the tour for us, is to tell that part of the story. Let's go on to the next. So this is the diagram from the book. It's people will say it's a bit Rube Goldberg, but that is the Evans mill. And if you see on the right, the man on the wagon dumping the grain into the scale to be weighed so the toll could be paid. And then it moves through the mill on its own through elevators and augers, going through every part of the milling process. Now, when Evans wrote his book and published it, he was a very smart man as a marketing man too. So if you'll notice, the subscriber plate in the image on the right listed all the people that bought the first edition. And you notice who's at the top in bigger lettering: George Washington, President of the United States. So I think Mr. Evans realized if it was good enough for George Washington, it might sell more of his mill patents across the states, which it certainly did. Now, this is a publication that was done by the Hagley Museum some years ago, and I didn't have a good image of the elevator, but what he basically invented, one aspect, was a bucket elevator. So if you look at that angled piece that goes through that drawing to the top, that's a belt with little cups on it, and that would move grain and also one for flour up into the mill. So it went up as grain, seed, wheat berries, went through a cleaner, went through the stones, goes up again to be cooled in the device on the right that Evans invented called the hopper boy. Now, you're going to sift this flour. You're going to bolt it through a large machine to make that superfine export flour. And it was bolted through silk, very fine silk. And if that meal was warm, which can happen when a mill runs all day, it can clog and clump, and you won't get a good sift. So prior to Oliver Evans, they had young men called hopper boys that would rake the flour. And Evans wrote in his book that they'd often tread in it while they did this. And I love this line in the book. He says, "Even then, people did not like to eat dirt if they could see it." And so Evans invents an automatic rake, which turns and spreads and cools the flour and automatically feeds it into the sifter, and from the sifter to the barrel. So again, once that wheat berry came in, no human hands touch it until it's put in that barrel. So it really revolutionized processing of flour, quality of flour, and was a huge leap forward for industry. And there's some of the flour that we make right there. It's amazing how fine it is. And so for the visitor, we do some demonstration grinding as well. So oftentimes, if it's not the highest grade wheat that we run, we don't sell it, because I'll see people with their hands in this, during the day. We want them to feel the flour. But when we do food grade product, we follow all the other procedures that are required so that we can sell that. So let's go ahead. Now we're going to the distillery here. So this is a 1929, 1930 image of the excavation that the state of Virginia did. So at the time the mill was excavated and rebuilt, they did archaeology and they found the distillery, but they didn't rebuild that. And I always ask people, well, why didn't they rebuild the distillery? Well, prohibition was ongoing and they thought, let's not even ask the state or the feds to rebuild a distillery at this time. So they covered it back up. There was a historical marker there for many years that indicated where Washington's distillery was. And that was the end of the story. The original distillery was built in the late 1790s, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But it burned in 1814. So it was just a field for many years. In fact, if the mill was torn down by 1850. So for many people in the area of Northern Virginia that would have walked by or ridden by on a horse in the Civil War era, they probably never really knew what was once standing there, these two industrial buildings that were really the heart of the money-making operation for Washington. So our archaeological team had the 1930s report, which formed the basis for the dig that we would do starting in the late 1990s. So I think I have some images of that next. There's a good aerial view of the opening up of the entire site. So what they found was burnt soils and brick remains around where the fireboxes were for the 5 stills. They found the cobblestone mash floor there, which you can see where they did the fermentation. And then there was a dividing wall between where they made the whiskey and where you store barrels, which is always a good idea. Whiskey is kind of flammable, so you want to keep that separate. And then they had an office there as well to conduct the business. Now, keep in mind, and we'll talk again more about this, but they did not barrel age whiskey in the 18th century. So this would have been clear like vodka. It went to market right away. And so our joke on the site is it aged from there to Alexandria, about 9 miles away. That was it. The aging of whiskey really starts around 1819, 1820. Now, it doesn't mean that people in the 18th century and earlier didn't know about barrel aging. They certainly did. And you see that in Europe, particularly with brandies and cognac, and sometimes with rum in the Caribbean. But for the American market, people were used to drinking it as a white whiskey, and that's how it was consumed. You may wonder what that big diagonal is through the middle of the whole site. Well, that was a wonderful 1970s utility trench that the county decided they needed to put right there, which those of us in preservation always, utter words which you can't utter here tonight, but why did they do that? Luckily, it didn't disturb too much. But the dig was a 6-year excavation that really told the rest of the story about the design of the distillery. And you can see Dennis Pogue, who was the head of preservation and archaeology, then down in the well. They had a freshwater well behind the distillery for water to make the whiskey out of. And they did find a few items like spigots and bits of this and that, but nothing major. The stills were long gone and long taken out. So. Now, the reconstruction started really in 2005. And the company that made the stills for us is called Vendome Copper and Brass Works. They're in Louisville, Kentucky. And they make a lot of the stills that you see in distilleries today. They're 5th generation still makers. So they got involved pretty early. And then we know that Washington had 5 stills. So really this was a commercial operation. This was not built just to make a little bit of whiskey. And just to give a little background on it, the time frame for this is 1797, just to tell you the whole story. So Washington's getting ready to come home, finally to retire, really the 3rd time to retire. And he hired a new farm manager named James Anderson, who just happened to be from Scotland and who just happened to have experience distilling. So the idea to distill at Mount Vernon was not George Washington's, it was James Anderson. And he proposed the idea. And at first Washington was a little hesitant because he was 65 years of age. I think he was looking to downsize, as I said, not build another business. So it took convincing, but Anderson was able to show Washington the profit was going to be huge. And still Washington being cautious with money, he agreed. He said, I agree to commencing distilling, but you can use the cooperage building. So next to the mill, there's a cooperage that they needed to make barrels for flour export, and that was built back in 1770. And so Washington's willing to try this idea, but he doesn't just agree to build a huge distillery. He says, put 2 stills in the cooperage and let's basically see how that goes. So they, with 2 stills, James Anderson's son, John, and an enslaved man made about 600 gallons of whiskey in 1797. It sold in Alexandria really well, turned a profit. Washington says, okay, this might work. His last bit of research, though, is he writes Colonel John Fitzgerald, a friend from the military, who had been in the rum business, and he asked his advice. And the letter came back and said that if you make good whiskey, it's going to sell. And that really sold it for Washington. It really was about that profit motive. So they commenced to build the big distillery in the winter of 1797, 1798. And it opened in 1798, and that year made 4,500 gallons of whiskey. So you go from 600 to 4,500 pretty quick. So as you can see, the work that the craftsmen did here, getting our stills in, I have a few more of the restoration because I thought it might interest you to see it come up from the ground up. There's the building going up. And again, just to remind you, we're built on the exact foundations of the original building. And it continued to form up. Floors coming in, the stills and the brick fireboxes. Those are just like bake ovens around the copper. So you could feed the fire, keep that heat in there. And we have a couple more, I think. Gable going up. And then let's see what else we have here. Looking better, looking like a building now. And there it is today. And in the background, you see the gristmill. You see how close they were. So it's kind of funny. Washington, when he agreed, he tells James Anderson, well, can't we build the distillery down by your house, which is closer to the main estate? And Washington was worried about theft. You know, alcohol theft happens today. And the way they do it in modern distilleries, if you read these stories, people won't steal a barrel. You get people taking a little bit out of a lot of barrels over a period of years so it's not missed. And Washington was concerned that there might be theft out here on this outlying farm. But of course, the reason the distillery is by the mill is you need the mill for grain. It has to be ground before it can be fermented and turned into mash. And also the mill pond and the existing water system was needed, which I'll explain how the stills run. So you already had the water infrastructure here on Doe Run Farm. Now, these are wood-fired stills, as you can see. We burn a lot of wood when we make our whiskey, not nearly as much as they did in the 18th century, but we go through quite a bit. I got 9 cords delivered today, in fact, for our production run that's going to start in March. So we can go ahead to the next. There's the front of the distillery, and that's the water trough I wanted to show you. So the mill race comes down to run the wheel, and they took water off that mill race to bring it into the distillery, and that's cooling water. And when we show you the stills, I'll explain what that water is key for. It's creek water, so if you visited Mount Vernon or the mill, and you look at that creek, you think to yourself, I hope they don't make the whiskey out of that water, and we don't. And that's why they had that freshwater well behind the distillery. So basically, that's cooling water related to the condensers on the stills. Okay. And that's inside during a production run. So again, those earlier pictures you saw, the restoration, take a look at the brick now. You can tell they've been well loved. We've made whiskey since 2007. And in a restoration like that, what I love is it looks lived in, it looks worked. People that visit, even when we're not running, they get a good feel for what a working distillery looks like. And so I've got a series here to kind of show you the interior here. So. There you go, looking the other way, basically. And there are a few barrels in the middle of the room that, yes, are full of whiskey. There's some of them, you see the glow under them, the fire's running. So I'm sometimes known as the paparazzi of the distillery. I probably have more pictures of this building than any living person, but I spend a lot of time in there, and it's hard not to snap photos while you're in there. Okay, we'll go ahead. Now this is rowing the mash. So basically with the same science applies today. You have to cook and ferment grains, and then they run through those copper pots to be distilled. So when we have film shoots, we're dressed out in period clothes. On the right, when we're not having film shoots, we were in our street or work clothes. The lady on the right pouring the grain is our consulting distiller, Lisa Wicker, who runs Widow Jane Distillery in Brooklyn. So if you're a bourbon lover, I can recommend Widow Jane. It's excellent. And Lisa's really helped us advance our program over the years, the last 6 years or so. And so we learned a lot from her. But basically, the corn and rye go into that big hogshead, that barrel there. And I think we can advance one here. And Joshua, thank you so much for doing that for me. I appreciate it. That's my office view usually. There's the mash rake, which I row with. And then, that's during our last, maybe a year ago or so, 2 years ago, row and mash. So it gets pretty foggy in there because we have a boiler that we heat up, and that creates that steam in the building. So it's not smoke you're looking at, it's actually boiling water steam. And so that mash rake is what's used to agitate and row that grain in there. So we go ahead and show maybe the next one. Again, during distillation time, I don't need to go to the gym for obvious reasons. It is a lot of hard work, and you understand why distilling in the 19th century became more automated, like a lot of industries. And working in here in the 18th century, we're 8 men, 2 paid staff. One was James Anderson's son, John, he was daily manager of the distillery. And then there were 6 young enslaved men that worked in there, enlisted as distillers. So Timothy was the youngest at 14, James was 26. And they likely lived in the building. We do not know if they lived in cabins like most of the slave population did on the outlying farms, but we have grown to have a lot of regard for those young men that worked in the distillery, because I mentioned to you the 1798 production figure of 4,500 gallons. Well, in 1799, those 8 men really outdid themselves because they did 10,942 gallons of rye whiskey and several hundred gallons of peach and apple and persimmon brandy. And we make about 1,400 gallons a year in 2 or 3 small runs. And we work 4 or 5 weeks straight, get to take a break. And those men back in that day just went on to the next batch and went on to the next batch and so on. So it's pretty tremendous when you think about how much grain went through the mill, how much mash they had to row, and the work of, all the firewood and feeding the fires. So on the left is Corey Welshans, my head miller. He's an excellent craftsman. And so this is us just getting to it. We can go on one more, I think. The gentleman on the left is a real character. If you work with living history people, we're an eclectic bunch, and that's Mr. Randolph Bragg. And yes, in the Christmas time, he does play Santa Claus. So I always make a number of Santa loves whiskey jokes to him, but he's a great man, and he's bucketing water from the boiler, which you see on the right. So that'll get up to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and you ladle in and bucket water, about 110 gallons per barrel, while the grain's going in. And you can see how steamy it gets in there. But the whole point is to cook as hot as you can to break down the starches. And then it cools for a period of time. We add malted barley. And malt has enzymes that'll convert starch to sugar. So the whole point of set and mash is to make a bunch of sugar off your grain. And then when it cools to about 90 Fahrenheit, we can pitch our yeast. The yeast is an organism that'll go to work, and it eats sugar and converts it to alcohol. So once we hit it with yeast, it'll ferment 3 to 4 days, and then you're real close to getting it into the still. So I think I got some good happy yeast photos next, maybe. Oh, there's some of the mash cooling. So ambient temperature, weather affects distillation. In fact, barometric pressure will even affect a still. We've learned that over time. And so the lids are off of these right now because we want them to bleed off some heat. You can see the ones on the left, they have lids on. So we have times when it's lids off to drop temperature, we row it. Then when we want to hold temperature, we put the lid on. In a modern distillery, if you visited one, they have the complete ability to control the stainless steel fermentation tanks. They can control the pressure and the temperature in the still. One of the hardships, but also the neat things about Mount Vernon and the way we do it, is we're recreating the methods they had to use and the way they had to think through and problem solve when you can't control all those variables. And when we have visiting distillers come, they actually love it. They step back in time with us. We've worked with some Scottish distillers before, and I remember one of them said the distillate was too hot coming off the still. And so one of my team grabbed a bucket of water and threw it into the fire. And this Scottish guy's eyes got this big because he knew he was on different ground, because back in Scotland, he can go over to the control panel and dial the temperature where he needs it. So everyone that works with us enjoys it, and we learn from them. And I always like to say that, I think Washington and Mount Vernon and the stories around him bring people together. And I think that at the distillery and mill at Mount Vernon as a whole, we have a lot of stories to tell that really kind of bring people together. And so working in here has brought us a lot of unique contact with some of the, if you're a whiskey drinker, some of the people in the industry you might know. they're some of the big master distillers. So we get the benefit of that, you know. So let's go on to the next. There's Happy East on the left. That's really Happy East. So when you see that, you know, all that rowing, all that bucketing has gone right. If it's really flat, you're very depressed because it didn't work. And every once in a while, you have one that doesn't turn out as good as you want. And then as it goes through a stage, that cap it has will start to settle down on the right. It's still actively fermenting, but it goes through stages. And then by the third day, you can tell it's settled down. It's consumed most of the fermentable sugars. And then we have to bucket it to the stills. And you can see those stills in the background there. So the heads of the stills, you can see the one on the left is rounded. The one on the right is flat. That just shows two different still designs of the period. And those heads can come off. So basically then you have an opening at the top of that big copper pot and we bucket that mash in. So we fill the still and then you're going to put the head back on and start your fire. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about distillation here. So we named all the stills. I don't know if they did in the 18th century. I kind of think they probably did. It's like kind of like sailing ships. So on the left, you're looking at Elizabeth. On the right is Anne. So we call these the queens, the twins. They're about the same size. In the middle of the room, we have Maggie. And Josh will like this because we were listening to Maggie May one night real late distilling. So the modern music came into that. Then the big still, the next one on the far right, not pictured here, is called Helen. And that's the name of James Anderson's wife, the Scottish farm manager. So we did an homage to her. And then the big still on the far end had many names over the years. But, you know, no, she's Helen, then Jane. So yeah, Helen and Jane. So those big stills, it's kind of graduated from about 98 gallons down to about 70. Now the wood fire, you stoke your fire with that mash inside because alcohol has a lower boiling temperature than water. So when the temperature inside that still reaches about 172, 173 Fahrenheit, alcohol will separate from the grain in the water and turn to vapor. It'll float up to the head of the still, and you can see those copper line arms that come down, those long arms. It'll start making its way down that arm. So let's take a look at the next image here. It's a good fire going. And we learned a lot about feeding fires right because we get that question like, how do you know how much wood to feed it? How do you know when it's too hot? It was a learning curve for us because there's no way to tell the temperature. So over a period of years, we've perfected the art of running these stills. And it's like a lot of things, I think, with historic trades, or if you know people that are craftsmen, you can read a lot about it, but until you do it and have experience doing it repeatedly, you pick up things along the way. So let's see the next one there. Here you go. This is what I wanted to get to. So this is a great diagram that really shows you basically what's happening inside the system. So that mash is in that still. We heat it up. It turns to vapor. The alcohol in vapor form comes down the line arm and starts going through that copper coil, which is the highly technical term for it is the worm. It's basically a condenser. And that cool water from the mill race flows through and cools the pipe, which then condenses that alcohol back to liquid, which will flow out the back. Now, what happens on tour a lot, and it's really funny, is the front drain you see is not whiskey. That's creek water. And in our distillery, it goes down through the floor through a series of drains and went back to the creek as it did in Washington's time. But as those of us who work and give tours, we always know people like to touch things and get closer to things. And so usually what happens to me is out of my peripheral vision, I'll see somebody think I'm not watching and they'll lean down there and think they're getting a little bit of whiskey from that spigot. And so I always like to make my way over to them and say, well, that's actually creek water, sir. So that's actually the cooling water going back down into the drain system. The good stuff comes out the back, and that's going to be your distillate. So when the distillate comes out, what you got to keep in mind is the first things that come out you don't want to drink. You all heard stories about during Prohibition and moonshine when people would get blinded by bad spirit. Well, what comes out first is methanol. And so that there's other compounds that come out that you do not want in your whiskey. And the term for that is the heads. So we make a heads cut and you can smell it change. And if you get a little on your finger, you can tell when it's starting to go into the good rye flavor. So we just watch that closely. And when it starts getting into what we call the hearts, and we take the heads cut away and destroy that. And then you let your still run for a period of hours, collecting that good flavor, that good whiskey. That's the hearts. And then at some point of the afternoon, it'll start to lose its alcohol content, and it goes into what we call the tails. So think about dishwater taste. It'll start to lose that, and at some point you cut the still off. Now what you have at that point is low wine. It's really not ready for market. So every bit of whiskey was distilled twice. So you'd have a number of days of doing mash, and then what they do is they clean the stills out and run the first run distillate back through, and that's when your proofs go up, your quality goes up. And whiskey really needs contact with copper. It's not just that copper is a good conductor of heat. That copper actually scrubs and polishes compounds and sulfuric parts of whiskey out of it. So you want to have clean stills and get that distillation done properly and end up with a good final product. Now, when you drain the still, though, after that first pass, you've got all that grain and water in there, right? And that's called slop, and that's animal feed. And they do that today in the industry as well. They feed, farms get the animal feed from major distilleries. So in Washington's case, he had a lot of livestock. So in front of the distillery, there were hog and cattle pens, and all that slop would go to cooling tanks and then on to feed those animals. So it's not alcohol. So you don't get, intoxicated pigs, but what you get is well-fed pigs. And in fact, there was a Polish visitor to Mount Vernon in 1798 that went around the estate with Washington, and they came out to the mill, and he saw the hopper boy because he mentions the flour aerator he mentions. And then at the distillery, he said they were the fattest hogs he had ever seen, that their bellies were dragging upon the ground. So all that's additional profit. They sold pork and beef out there as well as the whiskey. So, okay, we can move on to the next. Now there's our unaged whiskey that we make today. Again, it's a high quality spirit. In fact, in 2018, we were fortunate to win a silver medal at the American Craft Spirits competition for our unaged whiskey. If you visited in 2010, I could not say that about the unaged whiskey. So we keep a few of those early bottles around, which we call the keep you humble bottles, because you can drink your early stuff and think that's so great. It wasn't very good. We had a long way to go. We made progress over the years. But in the 18th century, again, that's how they did it. But being in a modern market, we do barrel age, and we have for years. So people want an aged spirit. So when you take whiskey and it's put in a charred oak barrel, I think most folks know this, it sits in there for a period of years. It takes on flavor from the oak and color as well. So that's why when you go to your liquor store, you see all that beautiful amber color is really from the barrel aging. And whiskey gets about 60 to 70% of its flavor from the wood. Let's go to the next one there, Josh. So there's some of our rye whiskey barrels laid down. We do buy barrels from a modern cooperage in Kentucky because we want to get it done right. So we're kind of walking between the 18th century and the 21st century market. And we've got a number of barrels aging now in the pipeline as we've made more over the years. So sometime in the next year, we will fill what will be our 200th barrel that's come out of the distillery. So we're still very small compared to even some craft distilleries, but we've hit some hallmarks the last few years. So I think we have a couple more here of the barrels and some of the bottles. Now I mentioned we also make other things. So if you look closely, if you can see that image, there's peach brandy, apple brandy, and malt whiskey. We've done single malt whiskey once. And on the far left, you'll see that barrel says bourbon whiskey. And we made bourbon in 2018. Now bourbon did not exist as a type of whiskey until about 1821. But what I found in the farm reports is in 1797 in the cooperage, they did not have any rye at that point. So they used corn and wheat. And so what we basically did is use that as a historical basis to make a bourbon whiskey, which is mostly corn. So every once in a while, we do something a little different, which keeps us creative. But Washington certainly made peach and apple brandy there. Okay, we have a couple more, I think. And there's some of the rye whiskey barrels on your left and some of our bottles there. And that's what the whiskey looks like aged about 4 years there. So you can see how much it picks up from the wood over a period of time. And the flavor profile is much different. With an unaged whiskey, you really taste in all the grain. You really don't get any of the benefit of the wood. So when we do tastings there, which we do, it's nice to walk people through and give them an unaged whiskey, a 2-year-old whiskey, maybe a 4-year-old whiskey. And it's a fun conversation to see how that spirit matures over the years. So There may be one more, and we're almost there, I think. There, well, I had to put it in there. There's our medal we got. We're proud of that. We hope we got more stuff to enter in some contests as we go forward. So I always joke with the team. It's like at least our trajectory is moving the right way. Our flavors are getting better. So I don't know if I had one more, maybe so. And there's the myriad of them, including the rum we made in 2018. So, when times are better, as I always say, I do hope some of you listening tonight will get a chance to come visit us. And the distillery is open April through October for tours. And we have an off season, which we do a lot of production and bottling in. And the main estate's open every day of the year. And so as all of us who are at historic sites, we're hoping for better times when people can come out more and come enjoy our sites, like the beautiful homes that you all manage and have up there. And I, look forward to a trip north as well myself. I'd love to see this. And anyway, thanks for your attention tonight and taking through there and telling the story of the distillery and mill. I hope that was informative for you.
Well, that was really fantastic. Thank you so much, Stephen. And I think at this point we can take some questions. And the way that you can do your questions, there's two ways. You can either chat down the bottom, or there is a Q&A feature, and you can type your question in either direction. While we're waiting for a few questions to come in, which Cindy and I will field. Steve, what was maybe this is a question for others, but what was Washington's favorite drink? What was his go-to? We talk a little bit about that here, but what was his go-to drink?
For him, it was Madeira, and he loved porter beer. And on occasion in the records, you can see that he had champagne on occasion. But the beer was so well loved by him that he would have it imported from England in the early days. And then when he was president, he found a brewery in Philadelphia that made great porter. And so as he comes home and retires to Mount Vernon, that porter is being shipped from Philadelphia down to Mount Vernon. And there's a funny letter where the man procuring it for him said, "I'm sorry to report to you that the brewery burned down, but I'm going to find you another source of porter." So I think those were his two go-tos. Was certainly
he never made beer.
They made a little beer on the plantation, yeah, but they were not they were made for consumption, not really in the house. And because he was wealthier, he could afford to bring in the beer that he wanted.
So Steve, we're getting some questions. I can read them to you. Jamie wants to know what's in your glass.
Well, not a GW whiskey at the moment because I have a lot of that. Tonight I'm drinking Blade and Bow bourbon, which is actually, if you've heard of Pappy Van Winkle, Blade and Bow is Stitzer Weller, which was the company that Pappy changed into. So, and yeah, it's a nice bourbon.
Another one, Katie Sullivan tells us that this was very interesting, and she is wondering if you produce all your grain there at Mount Vernon, and how many acres do you have?
That's a good question. We wish we could grow all our grain, but we have a very small demonstrational farm. It's not enough to grow enough for the distillery or mill. And so I go with a Virginia farm for most of my grain. That's in Tidewater, Virginia. Prior to coming to Mount Vernon, I worked at Stratford Hall, which is a Lee family home built in 1740s. And so I have farmers down there that I've known for years. And so we get our grain there, and we get occasionally out-of-state grain like white corn, which is hard to find. And in the last year and a half, we've started to get heirloom variety grains from Anson Mills, South Carolina. So we're starting to, broaden that. But it would be neat if we could grow it. But we only have about 500 acres total at Mount Vernon, which is taken up with the historic area, the farm, a lot of other maintenance areas. So there's just not the land. We wish we had the 3,200 acres back,
So not surprising, some of our board of managers are joining us on tonight's talk. And I'm very proud to say that my treasurer here at the Webb Dean Stevens and the Colonial Dames would like to know Great question. How much money is generated each year by the distillery? Maybe
Well,
we're thinking of doing something ourselves here.
well, it's been a nice revenue stream because these bottles are high priced because of the way they're made. And so they, stick out as far as price point, but we sell them out regularly. So over the years since 2007, we've probably sold $2 to $3 million worth of whiskey and brandy. Now we're in a high tax state, with Virginia being a control state. So there's about 50% of its tax, and we get the rest. But it's been beneficial to the overall mission. And I remember early on, Jim Reese ran Mount Vernon when I was first hired. He was there for 25 years, and he was a great man, really focused on education. And when our first batch of whiskey that he let us make sold out in 3 hours, he hadn't been keen on it. He called me into the office and said, "You need to figure out how to make more whiskey." So that was kind of the beginning of the program starting to grow. And so, but anymore, we're not about quantity. It's more and more about quality. So we went through some years where we tried to push the envelope, and we realized, well, we got to kind of dial it back a little bit, because at that price point, we want it to always be as good as it can be. But it's certainly been good for the museum.
So we have a couple of other ones. And one I think is kind of interesting, actually about kind of the grist pond and creek, and what happened, or what would happen if during the summer it ran dry.
Well, it's watermills, so you don't grind. And that happened a lot for Washington, because he called Doe Grun an indifferent stream. And so there were oftentimes the mill only ran 6 months of the year because of drought in the summer. So in 1780s, he says that little window when he's home before the Constitutional Convention, he ends up building a second dam and turning a second stream into the mill race to try to alleviate that problem. But with any water mill, two things happen. Sometimes you flood because you're built in a water plane, and then sometimes you suffer when Mother Nature doesn't bring you that rain that you need. So both of those things happened over the years. Now, the production totals for the distillery that I gave you for 1798 and 99, what that tells you was there was no drought that year, because there's no way they could have produced that much whiskey without the water. And I didn't mention, but our runs of whiskey that we make twice a year, it's 11,000 pounds of grain for 4 weeks worth of whiskey production. So it's pretty amazing how much the mill has to output to make that whiskey.
And how about, we've got two more here in the chat. Where do the bottles come from, and what of bottles during Washington's time? And then what would a price be for a bottle of whiskey in 1797?
Good questions. We buy from a major manufacturer. We used to get them overseas, but there's a company in America that makes our bottles. So with craft distilling being, just an explosive market the last 10 or 12 years, you've got a lot of choices as a small distillery with glass and other things. So that's easy to acquire. In the 18th century, they did not bottle whiskey. It went into casks or jugs, the old jugs you see people drinking out of. The potters were very important. Like if you go to Kentucky, in some of the places where the old Jim Beam distillery was, or these early ones, you'll see Potter's Lane. All these trades end up connecting, like in a small village. When there's a mill, there's a blacksmith, there's a wheelwright. So it would have been in small containers that the customer brought. For Washington, he put it in 30-gallon barrels that went into town. And the only difference with the modern age is that the barrels weren't charred on the inside. They were just vessels to get that spirit into town. The first regular bottling of whiskey comes in 1870, when Old Forester, if you've drank that bourbon, they were the first ones to bottle. And what was happening then, the industry was changing. And so the idea was about the consumer wants to see what they're buying. It's in the barrel. Over the centuries, I always like to joke, back then people cheated, not like today. So someone might have some whiskey and there's books on how to doctor it and flavor it to make it taste older. And you buy it from a guy down at the wharf and he says, this is 5 years old. And that morning he was filling it up and shaking the barrel around. So the idea with Old Forester was look at the quality. You could see through the glass. And that's when name brands and the whiskey brands we start to think of start to emerge really in the Civil War and just after.
Okay, how about where can you buy George Washington rye? So that's the first question. And then the second question I see, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'm still going to let you answer it. Where can I buy your whiskey in Connecticut?
Well, there's a little bit of the rub right now because hard alcohol is not treated like wine and beer, where people can ship across state line. So right now, and for many years, it was only available at the Mount Vernon shop. But last year, we placed ourselves in 12 ABC stores across Virginia, in Williamsburg, Charlottesville, places a little far from Mount Vernon. We didn't want to compete with our own shop. Since COVID hit, they changed the law in the legislature that we can ship within the state of Virginia and to DC. And there is lobbying efforts going on, not just in Virginia, but among other companies, to try to get on par with beer and wine, where if you lived in another state and you liked a certain brand, that they could ship it to you. So we hope that's coming down the road. But right now it's not possible. Off the record, I'm sure if you have friends in Maryland or Virginia and they come buy a bottle and how it gets to you, I don't know. I don't want to know. That may happen from time to time. But basically we can't ship, and they are high price bottles. So, our 4-year-old whiskey is over $200 a bottle. The unaged I showed you is about 98, and people do bulk at the sticker price, but I always remind them of two things, and I think you all saw this tonight. This is made like it was made in 1790s, so there's tons of manual labor that go into it, and the milling that goes into it. And again, being in a high tax state, Mount Vernon doesn't see that whole amount. And also, you're given to a very good cause. The legacy of George Washington, the legacy of everyone who lived and worked on this estate. And the stories we tell every day, I think, are worth giving to. And so a lot of people buy it to enjoy it, but they also think that they're helping a good cause.
Question from Dina, which is, why are the stills named after women only?
It again falls in line with much what you see in the time period, as I mentioned, with sailing ships and things of that nature. So we're following a bit of tradition now. It's not true in every distillery. There's maybe you in the Northeast know Whistle Pig rye whiskey made in Vermont. Dave Pickerell was the distiller and the founder of that brand. He passed away a couple of years ago, and Dave worked with us for years at Mount Vernon. He was a great man, great storyteller. And his big still up at Whistle Pig, he told me when we put it in, we named it Mortimer. So it's not uniform, but it just seemed to fit the time period we were in. So we just went that way.
And then an attendee would like to know, the black bag in your current picture says whiskey stones. What are whiskey stones?
Well, if you drink your whiskey neat and you don't like the water or an ice cube to dilute it, those whiskey stones you can put in your freezer. And so it'll cool your whiskey without melting to change the flavor profile of your whiskey. And that's what's interesting. If it really works well with Scotch. If you like Scotch, take some whiskey at home, put it in a proper glass, let it breathe a little bit, let it sit 15 minutes, sip it, and then add 2 or 3 drops of water and leave it alone for another 10 minutes and go back and try it again. The whole flavor profile can change. And if you have a high proof whiskey, like a cask strength whiskey, which some people enjoy, adding a little water will cut the proof point down 10 to 15 points. So for a lot of people, like occasionally, like in the summer, I like to put an ice cube in my whiskey. If I'm trying a new whiskey, I like to try it neat just to taste that particular flavor profile. But the stones give you that cooling without melting that ice down into your drink.
Well, I mean, this has just been fantastic. We're so pleased. I think many of us want to know when, and obviously we don't know because of COVID, but tastings start, if COVID allows, tastings will start in May?
No, probably summer. I talked with our marketing guy recently, and if things are looking better in summer, I mean, we did it in September this last fall, because in September is Spirits Month in Virginia. So I would just say, if those of you who want to come south, and keep an eye out on mountvernon.org, because we'll do it probably in the summer. But if you came in September, we did it on Saturdays in a tent outside the distillery, and all Virginia spirits are discounted 20% in September. So we sold quite a lot of rum and brandy and whiskey in September last year. So I would say keep a track on our website, and we will announce some of that. And I'd love to have groups if you come down and let you tour the estate and take you through the distillery. And hopefully by then, more vaccinations and people will be able to travel more, and we could, have more folks here. But we will likely do it outside, so it's an open setting. And I'll be there to talk to folks and do the tastings.
Super. Well, thank you very, very much. Great presentation. I think I'm a whiskey fan, so I'm anxious to get down and give it a little taste myself. But really great to have that history and learn about sort of not only the whiskey, but sort of the technology and of course the grist mill. So Steve, thank you. Thank you again to the Society of Cincinnati for helping to underwrite this presentation. We want to remind you that we are offering these presentations for free. If you feel so inclined and you want to support this kind of programming at the Webb Dean Stevens Museum, we'll be sending you a follow-up link. Please do respond to that. But really, we're just so excited that we can be here. And I know for Cindy and I, two history geeks, not only do we, and for Steve, but to be in the Webb House, in the Washington bedchamber, and in the parlor, it's really fantastic to have that connection that you brought for us tonight. So coming up, continuing our Thursdays with George series through the month of February. Next Thursday, please join us for George Washington through the photographer's eye. And then on the 25th, Lies Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon. We look forward to seeing you then. And we thank you again, Steve, so much for your time, your enthusiasm, and your passion for history and for keeping that alive. Thank you, most importantly, to all of you for joining us and for supporting the Webb Dean Stevens Museum. Until we see you again, stay well, stay safe. We'll see you next Thursday for lecture number 2. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.